Good day, welcome back. Today I am returning to my series on corresponding squares, where we are doing a bit of historical tour of the important names and composers in the development of the theory. Going way back now to a Czech player, that might be anachronistic, but anyway, a Czech player or composer, Jan Drtina. You can see a picture there, which is on Wikipedia, and we're going to look at two studies today. One from 1907, which I've got there, and it's sort of a simple one, 1908, which everybody has seen, but it's also a very, very good little instructive example, and we'll look at it in the context of corresponding squares. Now, as I say, I don't find much material on Drtina on the internet, but we'll just try and put it together. I've just sort of shown here what sort of period he was around. You can see he's pretty early in the development. We've had corresponding squares sort of by Walker, and then the bigger names Locock, Grigoriev, Bianchetti, and obviously early 1900s. We're going to eventually get to Lasker Reichholm as well. So very early on in the development. And what I did find in terms of trying to understand his role is this article on ChessBase, an older article from 2020, and it talks about the Daedalus, sorry about the pronunciation, brothers, and these players were known for working with Drtina. So let's have a look. If you look at the 1990 article, which is talking about an article on Drtina's theory of critical squares in pawn ending. In 1919, it's very early, and German language refers to critical squares as Gegenfelder, anti-fields, opposing fields, mutual Zongzong, all that sort of stuff, right? So obviously Drtina is well known as being part of the development process when we're talking about corresponding squares. And as we've seen, that involves a lot of those sort of thought processes of mind squares, mutual Zugzwang, right? So one player to move is win, the other player to move is draw, and so on. We've seen that in a lot of the corresponding squares we have looked at. So that's a bit of background. I'd recommend, let's see, you can see the URL for that story there. I found that quite interesting, and as I will probably do Daedalus studies next time, because he's got a very equally very famous one that once you've seen it you'll remember it and know the answer. So and obviously also sort of will fit our process here of looking at corresponding squares. Okay, so here we go. Here is the first position to look at, by the way. So this is 1908 apparently. And this one, think about it first, and then you think about it, and you know the solution, come back. And so I think this is one of the sort of earlier endgame studies people see. Once you've seen it, you can't unsee it, and you know what the solution is. And it's got a lot to do with, shortest paths, and diagonal paths are the same as straight paths in terms of time taken. Reminds you a little bit of the Reti study in that way. And so let us now go through the solution. Okay, so let's remember our process here. First of all, we identify the key squares, and the key squares are the squares one in front of the pawn, because in that situation, if you're on those squares, you've got the tempo move, so you can always take the opposition and win the game. Okay, so what we'll do now is just to understand position. This is a simple position, but just to understand a little better, let's just run my little script. Looks like that. There's the position, and we're moving the king around, and let's change the result to a draw and white to move. And here we see that if the white king's up here, then it's just a win. If the white king is on b4, then black has to be on b6. That takes your position. On c6 for c4, and on d6 for d4. Okay, that makes sense. I've done earlier videos on this sort of simple how do you win in these king and pawn endgames. Okay, so let's go back. So if the king is on b3, then because we're threatening to go to b4, black has to be in a position to go to b6 on the next move, and those green squares, he can do that. And you can't be on the a file, because the a file, then we would just diagonally duck across here and win that way, right? So we're on b3. If we move to b4, well, we can't move to b4 if the black king was on b5 or c5, but you get the idea. So that's where black has to be to cover the white king. And now we go back to the c2 square, and now you got all those squares where the black king can be, because obviously he will be able to cover, in the worst case scenario, he'll be able to cover the b6 square in 2 moves, and that's what all he needs to do. And then get back to the d1 square, which is the start of the study. Now you'll see that the point here is that the black king on f8 is actually outside that set of squares. Point is that if so So you understand the solution there is you go diagonally across and you actually get to a b4 before black can get to b6. Whereas if you go straight, which obviously seems like let's just go straight up, then of course the black king is able to get to d7 and then the d6 square in time. Okay, so that's just sort of showing you that. Let's close that. And now let's do that on the corresponding squares, which is almost like a flood fill in Adobe Photoshop or something, right? So we'll only match out these ones. Corresponding square 1 has to be matched there. Corresponding square 2, realistically speaking, you're going to be on one of those two squares. Corresponding square 3, and let's say it's like a flood fill, so we could be there or there. And then corresponding square 4, well, you have to be there, and the black king is not there. So this is just a tempo thing. If the black king was one file further across, then the position would be a draw because you could block. Okay, so that simple study by Dottino, it just sort of says, okay, be aware that the shortest path is not always the sort of the straight path in inverted commas. Just before I leave this position, I did want to sort of show the idea. We were talking about corresponding squares and key squares, but actually this is a pawn counting exercise. We've already said that if we get to b5 before black does, we're winning. So let's do the pawn counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, have a look at the black side of this. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, he's too slow. Whereas if we go directly, let's look at the direct run. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. Blocks in. 3. Blocked. So you can see just from simple pawn counting. That's the other way of looking at it. Simple pawn counting. This position is also only wins for white if he outflanks down the queen side. Okay, cool. So there's that one from 1908. And now let's go and have a look at the second study, which is this one, which looks a little bit more complicated. And I believe this is in Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual, because there are a lot of a few blogs on chess.com and Lichess which have this position and also kind of have Dvoretsky's solution to it. And so basically, I'm doing this in corresponding squares. I think Dvoretsky looked at more from an opposition perspective, but we'll just get a good sense of why this position is winning for white and what the winning technique is. And maybe it's not what you think, so I think the best thing to do here is to stop the video and either match it out as corresponding squares, or alternatively do it with opposition, but try and work out how white wins this position. Okay, so let's match out the key squares. Be the 3 squares either side of the pawn. I'm just going to undo the last two so I can see what's going on. So that if we are on f5, black has to be on f7. Now I could have done the same simulation thing. Let me do that so we can see it. Result f5, f7, g5, g7. H file's not so relevant. And then you go back and you can see that if we're on f4, then it's got to be f8 or f6. So that when we move up, you can go to the position. Obviously, in f6, we can't move up, and same thing there. And it just goes backward, right? So you've got to be on those matching corresponding squares. Yeah. So basically, that's just saying you have to keep the opposition. White's on white square, we move on white square. White's on black square, we move on black square. And that applies to both the G and the F columns. We have to keep the opposition to keep the white king out. Doesn't apply on the E file, because you look at the E file, we just sit there. The thing is, white can't move on to the E5 square. That's the main point. So that opposition is irrelevant. But when we hop across to the F file, you can see we have to grab that opposition, those two squares, right? If we hop onto the white square, we've got to go to F7 or F5. Goes on the dark square, we've got to go to F6 or F8. Okay, so that sort of gives you a sense of where we're going to. So let me get that. Okay, good. So we're doing this, and then the corresponding square 2 is there. Right, so now we move backwards. 3, going to be there or there. 4, going to be there or there. Okay, keep going backwards. 5, there. That's the most logical square. 6, there. Okay, makes sense. Now we go 7. It should be there or there. 8 should be there or there. And now you see what the problem is. Actually, king to g1 actually does win. Eventually, white has to go back and go to g2. Now you can see that if we go king to f2, that won't win because the black king will just sit on f6 or f8. And if we go back to e file, as I said, e file's not winning at all to be starters. But if we go to g2 square in particular, then black cannot get to a square marked 8. That's a problem. So you can see the progression here. If we go to G2, then if black goes to the F file, in fact, this is the problem. Whenever black goes to the F file, we are going to be able to hop onto the F file and take the opposition from him. And if he doesn't go to the F file, then we just keep on going up the G file. So you can see the problem is that black can't get onto the G file to take the opposition. If black's king was in a better square, like say f7 to start off with, then the position would be drawn because he would just hop on and take the opposition from you. So that's the winning strategy, right? So it's going to be go there, and then you can do let's say we go to that square. Well, then we'll take 5, and now we've got the opposition. So let's play it out. Let's play it out as we're doing it. That might be the best thing to do. We go there. So we hop onto the 5. So he goes there. Then we're the clearest one. So now we're threatening to go to 1, a 3, and a 5. Oh, okay. So this is the problem. We're threatening to press our pawn now. So let's see if we go back to try and stop that. So I should have mapped out the other side of the board. Because basically we've got the same position here where we've moved around to the other side and we're too slow. So that was one way of winning, where you get the corresponding squares, where you get the key squares on the queen side. And then the line which was given in Dvoretsky, which I've seen on some blogs, is actually where he just does it on the king side. Let's get back to the starting position. And the line given there, king g2, and then we go king f6. So fortunately my squares are gone now. King f2, taking the opposition. And this is where if you go king e7, so this kind of covers the queen side, like we looked at in the previous, king g3. Once again, we're staying on the g file, which is stopping black from getting to the squares he needs. King f7, king f3, taking the opposition, white square, king e7, king g4, king f8. Where do we go now? Opposition, king e7, diagonal opposition, king f7, opposition. And now we're going to outflank blank, and eventually another pawn will drop. Winning. So the two things will happen. That if black covers passively like that, then we'll break through on the king side, and if black tries to stay on the F and the G files, then that gives us time to return to the queen side and get the key squares. That was a very little interesting study. It's quite a basic one, but once again, it just reinforcing the fact that corresponding squares is sort of the implementation of opposition, but it also has the idea of you need to take into account that you can break through on both sides. Okay, great. Hope you enjoyed that, and thank you very much for watching.